there we go. Okay, well, for those of you who don't know, I'm Brad Wolf. I'm with Peace Action Network of Lancaster in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We are an affiliate of Peace Action, and we are also an affiliate of World Beyond War. And we're happy to be joining together with 1040 for Peace tonight to sponsor this event. 1040 for Peace is another local peace group here in Lancaster. They are war tax resistors. I encourage you to go look at their Facebook page. They do wonderful things in the community, and we've worked on them with a number of projects in the past. So happy to be working again with 1040 for Peace tonight. And we are excited. I've been looking forward to this for weeks to talk to Francesco. Francesco Da Vinci is an author, journalist, photojournalist, documentarian, and anti-war activist. And he has recently written a book called, and I hope you can see this, I Refuse to Kill. Now, I know some of you have not read it, but I encourage you to go out and read it because it's fantastic. It's really two stories in one. It's the story of the 1960s anti-war movement and all the iconic figures of that era. And Francesco was able to meet most of them, amazingly so. And he's going to talk about that tonight. But it's also the story of a courageous young man who's following his moral convictions to have his conscientious objector status accepted by the Virginia Draft Board. And the sticking point for Francesco was that his conscientious objector status was not based on religious beliefs, but rather on his moral convictions. And that led to a 5-year battle with the Virginia Draft Board and the courts, and Francesco going through 9 attorneys, all of whom I think probably got frustrated with his unwillingness to accept deferments that were being offered to him. So it's a fantastic story. We're going to want to get into all that. And so at this point, Francesco, welcome. Good evening.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
Great. I'm happy to be here. And thank you, everybody at Peace Action, for having me today.
Well, you are certainly welcome. I thought to get us started, if you just wanted to give us a little bit about your family background and history up into the point where the Vietnam War heats up and you're facing the draft. Just
Sure.
Sort of where and when you were born, family dynamics, and influences as they pertain to the development of your moral framework.
Thank you. I wondered if I should do that with the pictures, or
That would be great.
I could go right into it. Great.
Okay.
Carrie is here. I just wanted to pay tribute to my assistant who, is keeping the ship afloat here.
Hi, Carrie. How are you?
I'm going to share our screen.
She's sharing the screen now.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Will I be able to see everybody
Okay.
too? Oh, great. It's coming in. Is that it?
Yeah, ask if they can see it.
Can you see it? Is everybody on board to see that clearly?
Yep, we can see
Okay,
it.
wonderful. So we're going to go through the 60s, but I thought I'd give you the background of what led me to be an activist, because I want to make it clear I started out completely as a bystander. I happened to be raised with wealth in a mansion in an all-white segregated neighborhood of Virginia, which also made my draft board particularly tough because they were so pro-war and conservative. But I was really oblivious to issues, raised in that kind of, every house was about 2.5 acres apart from each other. So it was not like a normal neighborhood. And then the civil rights was one of the first things that led me to be, do introspection, like, gee, I have really been clueless to this. And as you know, TV was the medium that brought the civil rights movement into our living rooms, just as it later did for the war in Vietnam. And I'd like to mention, if anybody has a question along the way, or they particularly on an image or anything, please feel free to speak up. And I don't mind, going back and forth as we go here. Is that everybody okay with that? Okay. So this is a portrait that I took of Rosa Parks when I met her after the famous boycott. December 1st, 1955 was when she refused to go to the back of the bus. And particularly in Virginia, where I was all segregated. And I couldn't even remember seeing a Black student in my entire high school. That's how segregated it was and isolated. Then President Kennedy came, let's go to right 1960. And I was at the inauguration as a teenager. And my parents rented a hotel suite directly over the route that President Kennedy and Jacqueline took, going by in a car and waving to everybody on inauguration day. And I leaned out the window with my buddy and we both yelled, "Hey, Jack," to the president as loud as we could. And he happened to look up, pick up his top hat and waved it to us. So that was one of those unforgettable moments, that you can't believe it really happened. And, he inspired us. He told young people, get involved. Don't just talk about these things. And, he was the youngest president. And also he was directly speaking to our generation saying, do what you can for the country. Don't just receive. Then along comes the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I was in high school and I was one of the photographers. And so as you probably, many of you can remember, the duck and cover exercises, right? Under the desk. And I remember that I was taking pictures of the students because I didn't see how this could be a practical measure for nuclear war. And the teacher said, "Francesco, get under the desk because if the bomb doesn't kill you, I will." So I got under the desk, but I took this picture first. Anybody remember that time? The fad of fallout shelters and all that? Okay, and this is, as you know, it was only about 1,000 days into the presidency when President Kennedy was assassinated. And then I paid tribute. I went about a week and a half later, I went to pay tribute at the gravesite. And if you can imagine how much in mourning the country was, this is about a week and a half after the president had been killed. And look at this endless line of mourners. It was 24/7 all through that time. And this is looking down, and this is my picture. I'm standing at the gravesite looking back. And this is my best buddy, Jerry. And even though we were best friends, we had totally political different views, it was opposite. And so he believed that conflict can best be served with military might. And I believe that the power of nonviolence was the best way to resolve conflict. But I want to stress that we had a spirit of reconciliation. It's like we accepted each other's differences. And that's really what America's supposed to be about. And we've really lost sight of that, listening and talking to each other, because we're all in this together, not only in America with our differences, but in the world, So that's one of the beautiful things about America. But, he respected me for what I was doing and vice versa for what he was doing. He was following his conscience and his sense of duty. Mine led a different path. This was the destroyer that he was on in Vietnam, and they were shelling the shores night and day. And he made me aware of, the military perspective, because I didn't have a clue about that really. Because so he was in charge of the guns, and he would say things like, "Francesco, you're naive. Nonviolence will never work because there will always be someone to pull the trigger." And one day he went out to the guns and he saw the gunner being dragged off by MPs. And he says, "What's happening?" And it turns out the gunner just said, "I will not kill anymore. I'm following my conscience. I can't do this and I won't do this." And they put him in the brig. And then very quickly, my friend Jerry said he was replaced. And he said, "See, this is an example. There will always be someone to pull the trigger." 1964 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. And this arrow here, this points to where I was with my buddy. And we're at the Democratic Convention, 17 years old. It was a big thrill. And there we are. What happened was, walking to the convention, just by coincidence, we ran into Bobby Kennedy's car and everybody quickly surrounded it. He got out, climbed up onto the roof of the car and gave a spontaneous talk telling us to get involved. And of course, that gave me a flashback to his brother, John Kennedy, saying a similar thing. And here we are in 1964. And this was the day that Bobby Kennedy went into the Democratic Convention, and it was very emotional. And when he went to speak, there were like about 20 minutes of uninterrupted applause in tribute to him and his brother. This is the portrait that I took. I don't know if I can do that, but if you can see it, how close we were, to Bobby at the time. I supported Bobby later. I'll get into that. And my girlfriend was a supporter of McCarthy, but we were so happy they were peace candidates. But that's another example. We supported our differences were there. This is became my fiance, Jane, and she supported McCarthy and I supported Kennedy, and it was a loyal opposition that way. But we didn't care who won, whether it was Bobby or McCarthy, because they were both peace candidates and they were both had a consciousness of civil rights and carrying on Dr. King's legacy. This is the first big national march against the war in Vietnam, October 21st, 1967. It was called the March on the Pentagon. And I got to tell you, it was scary stuff because personally, I had never participated in a march before. And, a lot of people painted if you protested, you were a troublemaker. All the labels came, you were unpatriotic. A lot of people forget how intense the polarization was. I would say it was even worse than it is today. And, you had to just be out. This is the first big one. So it was particularly tense. And my girlfriend was worried that we'd be kicked out of school just for participating and got our picture in the paper, because I tended to go to the front row of these things. We were in the third row, right behind Dr. Spock and Norman Mailer. This is, you had a choice at the Pentagon. Norman Mailer wrote about this in Armies of the Night and won a Pulitzer for it. So a great book. And this is when you had a choice of going up the stairs to the Pentagon or remaining below. If you went up the stairs to talk to the soldiers, which is what I wanted to do, you were risking arrest. It was civil disobedience. But so my girlfriend waited down below. I went up and tried to talk to the soldiers. And I looked for a kind face to who I could talk to, so to avoid the hostility and hopefully somebody I could communicate with. And when I found a soldier that I kind of related to, I said to him, I want to make it clear, we're not against you. At least speaking for myself, I am not against you at all. I'm against your orders. I mean, here's my best buddy in Vietnam. I wanted to make it clear, we're against the war, not the individuals, not the soldiers. And a lot of times the press would try to play the protesters off with the soldiers, and they didn't want them working together for peace, which of course eventually evolved. So they would distort how much the abyss was between the soldiers and the anti-war people. And really, it wasn't as extreme as was portrayed in the media. Now we're going to jump to when the Poor People's Campaign came along in Washington, D.C. I participated, and this is the march that Martin Luther King was organizing, but he was assassinated in Tennessee at the Lorraine Motel, and it was another assassination. So we're talking about 1968. I was starting to get burned out because by this time I was definitely burning with desire to help promote civil rights and end the war in Vietnam along with the draft. So it was very demoralizing. We lost President Kennedy. Now we lost Dr. King. And in my book, I call it a hammer to the heart. And that's what it was. Well, the hope was Bobby Kennedy for president or Eugene McCarthy for those of us who were peace activists. And I supported Bobby, like I mentioned, and my fiance supported Eugene McCarthy. So during the campaign for Bobby, I went to a charity benefit that Bobby was speaking at, and is at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. For those of you who know it, maybe know the D.C. area. That's where I was raised. And I went there, and we had big tests to study for, so we had to leave early. And so we were hurrying down a side quarter because we wanted to beat the crowd at intermission and leave, but we wanted to pay our respects and contribute to the charity, which we did. But as I'm hurrying out the corridor, somebody else was coming the other way, and bam, we collided chest to chest. And I didn't even see who it was, but I looked over at my girlfriend and she had her hand over her mouth and she went, "Oh my God, it's Bobby Kennedy." And that's who I almost knocked over. And he apologized and I apologized. We just couldn't believe it. And then I took a moment, I composed myself as best I could without stuttering, and being totally in awe. And I said, "Bobby, I feel like sincerely, you're the only candidate that really can heal America and bring us back together again." Because the other politicians were trying to do it, just playing the right against the left, et cetera, like Nixon. And, that I knew that would never fly. So that was my experience meeting Bobby Kennedy for the first time after running into him at the Democratic Convention just by fate. We ran into each other. That's, again, the picture I took at the convention. Let's see, there it goes. Now, 1968, I kept putting off applying as a CO. Sometimes you want to do the right thing, but for whatever reason, you might have rationalizations or whatever, and you put it off and you put it off. And finally, I couldn't stand to look at myself in the mirror. And I said, "Here's my buddy in Vietnam. He's following his sense of duty. Well, it's time I followed my sense of duty in my way." So I said, "I'm going to tear up my student deferment. I'm going to apply as a conscientious objector." I knew the risk. I underestimated, of course, the hostility of my Virginia draft board. But nevertheless, I took the stand finally. And these were my role models. And it was Gandhi, Einstein, and Dr. King. And when I applied, at that time, just to remind people, if you were in college, you had a deferment, you could ride it out as long as possible. But when a lot of people think, you apply as a CO, it's the easy way out. It's not, it's just the opposite, because you're tearing up your student deferment, you're at risk for prison. And today, I would remind people, all the folks at Peace Action, when you're talking to people, sometimes we assume we know more than people on the outside do who are not working directly for peace. And they think they know what a conscientious objector is, but they really don't, because they equate it with avoiding the draft. They equate it with draft dodger. And, that drove me crazy all the time, because the COs were just the opposite. If they were not approved by their draft board, they willingly went to prison. Well, and meanwhile, 30 to 50,000 went to Canada, and over 600,000 illegally evaded the draft. So I feel it's way overdue that we pay more respect to the conscientious objectors throughout history. They should be in our history books. We should have statues, memorials to conscientious objectors, and let's promote the honest history of COs and give them their due respect. So my story, excuse me while I dwell on this a little bit, I'm getting a little emotional, because, I stood on the shoulders of other COs. Throughout history, they were slandered, they were tortured, and many times they were even killed. They've been executed ever since Roman days. There were Romans who took it seriously, "Thou shalt not kill," and they put down their sword and they were slain for not killing. And in Alcatraz and Leavenworth in America, they would, manacle COs in a prison cell, and the toes barely touch the floor at all. Bread, water, etc. And in Germany, there were Jehovah's Witnesses that opposed Hitler, and they were executed. And a lot of incredible courage stories that the general public still doesn't know about. This is when I met Muhammad Ali. It was years later, and I thanked him for his conscientious objection to war. His case went to the Supreme Court, and our cases went at the same time. It just happened to be. And he declared in 1967, he faced the draft board in Houston. And of course, he gave up everything for this, as Dr. King acknowledged. You know, he faced 5 years in prison. Eventually, my draft lawyer said I was facing 5 years in prison because I became a prominent activist and they were going to make an example out of me in Virginia. So I definitely had simpatico there. And he became like a world icon, you know, for conscience. He gave up everything. He lost prime years for his boxing career. And he became a symbol for, he loved people in general around the world. And I had the honor of working with him 3 different times and photographing him and taking his portrait. Again, about the history of COs, you know, here they are serving alternative service. Personally, when I finally won my case, I served 2 years alternative in a barrio of San Diego. And a lot of people still don't realize that COs do serve alternative service. This is from 1916. And so I'm glad it's preserving the history of these COs. This was my state. So you can see that the mood right here in our state flag, it's incredible. You know, a soldier with its foot on the crest of a dead soldier. And it says, "Thus ever to tyrants." Well, that was right in my draft board when I went in for my interview. You know, it just, there was the tone of the whole thing. And, you know, Virginia has a long history of not being progressive with civil rights, to say the least, and then being extremely pro-war. But when I came in and to the interview, was a face-to-face interview, their job was just to see if I was sincere. And that's the job of draft boards across the country. So, you know, you're in Pennsylvania, whatever state you're in, you retain that lifetime draft board. So if you happen to have a draft board in the Bay Area, it's totally different than your draft board in Virginia. So that's a geographic unfairness about the draft right off the bat. So when I went into this interview that was really an interrogation, it turned into it, I saw quickly that they weren't doing their job, that they didn't care if I was sincere. That's what they were supposed to determine. And that happens for many COs. They wanted to punish me for even taking the stand. So that's something to be aware of about conscientious objection. So they turned me down 4-0 after the interview. I was hoping to reach them. And then I was called quickly for an induction call. I was called 3 times for induction calls. You know, one of the things, if you combine conscientious objection with peace activism, it's really a red flag. And at that time, you know, they were monitoring under J. Edgar Hoover, all the peace activists. The more active you were, the more they would monitor you. This is a famous fort called Fort Holabird in Maryland. And this is where they sent me for my first induction. And of all things, there were 300 and some draftees called in. And at the end of it all, after we went through the physical, and I declared my conscientious objection, they said to the crowd, "Everybody can leave except Francesco Da Vinci." And, you know, this is scary stuff. You know, you're a young guy, about 21, whatever, 20. And to see 300 people leave and you're detained, you know, I didn't know what was going to happen. My girlfriend is waiting for me out in the car. And they brought me to an interrogation room. I didn't know my rights. And you can imagine how much more dramatic that is for minorities who even usually have equal access to things like a lawyer or their rights. And I didn't know my rights either. And they brought me to this interrogation room and they quizzed me about my political beliefs. And I didn't know what was going to happen to me or anything. And they told me that if I didn't cooperate completely, and this was totally illegal, I found out later, that I would be required to stay overnight at the military jail. And, you know, I gave into it because I was scared. And I just answered honestly as I could to their questions, why I believed in conscientious objection. I said, you know, you believe this way, I believe this way. And so finally, I was released after being fingerprinted, treated like I'd committed some big crime. It turns out later that this was the nation's center for spying on American civilians. 18 to 25 million Americans had files on them. So, you know, peace action, you can imagine any peace activity, they were monitoring heavily, and this was the center for the whole nation. And finally, they were busted by the US Senate. They ordered that it be dismantled. Personally, I don't believe they ever really dismantled the files. I think they just shifted and it was forgotten and they just moved all the stuff. But that's my personal view. I don't have documentation of that, but my feeling is it goes on today just as much as it did then. Okay, they called me for a second induction in Los Angeles. And this woman, you know, to pay tribute to you guys out there, the members of Peace Action, I salute you, my hat's off to you, and I thank you for your service. You know, there are different ways to serve. And like I told my buddy Jerry, I feel a sense of duty, and this is how we're serving nonviolently. And so I'm taking a moment just for a second. This is a Quaker lady who's paying tribute by reading all the names of the war dead. And I can tell you that the vast majority of them were extremely young. The vast majority. Incredible. You're talking about from teens to early 20s, the vast majority. So I'm taking a moment just right now with all of you, Peace Action, that are listening today. Just give me a moment for just a little few moments vigil. I want to pay tribute to all the peacemakers, the conscientious objectors, and the people that the tragic loss on both sides, I might add, because we're talking about all the people that were killed, American, 58,000, but we're talking about several million Asians. For what? For pride of the presidents. They didn't want to be the first to lose a war. So let's pay tribute just for a few moments to these people. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm gonna get it back together here. So if you can imagine the emotion as I'm walking to there's the examining center. I'm walking into the induction and I'm hearing this woman's voice call out the names one by one and their age, you know, like Mike Sharp, 20, and it goes on endless. So I'm very torn as I go into the induction center, even though I know I'm just declaring my conscientious objection and I have to go through another physical exam to go through the motions and declare my CO again. I'm still torn with emotion. And so much so that when I'm near the door here and I'm inside, I can still hear her voice. And I go, today, and this is my protest for the killing, because the killing is going on and escalating, 1968 now, and then 69. You're talking about 500,000 troops in South Vietnam, and the killings going on. The body counts are daily news. So I said to the officer, I'm leaving. I can't do this today. And this is my moral statement against the war, the draft, and the killing. And I'm saying no to war. And he ordered me back. And I said, I'm sorry, I just cannot do this and will not do this. So I go out, I call my draft attorney. I think this was number 8. And I tell her, and she begged me on the phone, please go back in. You know, you're already on thin ice as it is. spiritual but non-religious conscientious objector. Virginia's your draft board. Go back in, please, Francesco. And I said, I can't, I won't do it. But she said, I was waiting for her to retort, and she broke down and sobbed. And she said, I'm having a nervous breakdown over this. This is the last day as your lawyer. Get somebody else. I can't take it. I hate to see these young men going to prison. Bam, clicked. So I was on my own, had to look for another attorney. This is a little levity here, because I was in grad school at what is now Alliant University in San Diego. It was called U.S. International University. And the dean knew about my peace activism and conscientious objection. And in the middle of the term, and I had the highest grades, he kicked me out of the school with no explanation. But he said to the students in a big class that I was in, he walks over to my desk and he says, make no mistake about it, the rock throwers are right here among us. And here I am, a nonviolent activist, a conscientious objector. But that was the climate, that was the climate. It was so polarized. And so I called the ACLU, and they said, oh, this is clear discrimination. And they gave the university a choice: either reinstate him or we'll talk about it in court. Miraculously, a week later, I'm reinstated with an apology from the university. But that's what COs, that's part of what they go through. This is 1969, People's Park in Berkeley. I don't know if you folks, anybody there knows about that, but this was a park for the university right off campus. And it was community thing, for children and seniors. It's a people thing, right? And so City of Berkeley and the university decided they're going to pave it over for a parking lot. Hence the Joni Mitchell song, that great song about parking lot. That's what it refers to. And so there was a big protest. And I happened to be in the Berkeley area with my fiance. And we said, we got to support this. So it turned out that it got so polarized that the troops turned around at one point, and there was rock throwing. This is crazy from the protesters, and even some people threw stones and that kind of thing. So you've got to acknowledge both viewpoints, but there was no justification, certainly, for the violence that they unleashed on the unarmed students. And at one point, they just turned and they fired, and some student threw a rock, and they would shoot just in the direction of something. This is live ammo, and they killed a guy who was just a bystander on the roof because somebody had thrown a rock from the roof, and they blinded another one because the bullets came right into his face. So that was People's Park. And I was at the front, and I begged my girlfriend, please don't come to this march with me. But even though I was feminist, I felt very strongly at times at the risk, knowing the risk that people could open fire. But she insisted. I had to respect it. And this is from the front line where I photographed this the next day. Okay, this is one of the children I saw at the protest. I thought it was very symbolic of the 60s, kind of an iconic image. And peace sign there. By the way, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the story about the peace sign, but real quick, the semaphore signals up and down and out, ND, nuclear disarmament. That's the most widely held theory of the peace sign. 1969, the same year. What an incredible decade, folks. I mean, everything happened in the 60s. It was like, hundreds of years compressed into one decade. And so what happens at the end of 1969? Humanity is going to the moon. Amazing. And I looked at it as our first baby steps into the cosmos. I'm already a space nerd. So I followed it, and I dragged my girlfriend up to these launches on TV, sometimes in the middle of the morning, 3 a.m. or whatever it took. But I was so enthused. And I never thought that my hero, Neil Armstrong, that I would meet him. And then later, when I became a photojournalist after the 60s, it was a Bob Hope special on NASA, and Neil was the guest. and I photographed him, and we became best buddies. And it was like, oh my God, I'm so honored. You know, there's nobody I wanted to meet more than Neil Armstrong, and from Ohio. And by coincidence, the Apollo 11 crew, all three of them were born in 1930, the same year. Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and Neil. And so Neil and I stayed in touch for over 20 years, and we'd email every month to each other and update on the news. Then 1970, okay, my case is in jeopardy, but now I'm really digging in for activism, and I want to help. My things are human rights, civil rights, and the draft and the war. That's my focus. And I started by working for the farm workers through Cesar Chavez, and that was San Diego. And I just volunteered. And, you know, the farm workers were so exploited. They had no union or anything, no health care. Sometimes they would even spray the crops with the farm workers in the field. So this is the group that I formed. I had this dream of forming a peace group, and I talked to Cesar about it, and he encouraged me. He said, just do it. And I called it Nonviolent Action. And the reason is that so many people think of nonviolence as just not being violent. You know, that's a myth. Nonviolence requires the action. And the same with peace, you know. Peace is not just the absence of war. We have to work at it. Same with democracy, you know, the eternal vigilance, working for freedom. You know, we have to be vigilant about it. And so, you know, I wanted to keep my spiritual beliefs as a human being and as an individual, but I also wanted to define myself and my peace group in action. And so I called it Nonviolent Action for that reason. I founded it on July 4th because I thought it was independence in a different way, standing against violence and providing alternatives, 1970 in San Diego. And this is when I talked to Cesar, and that's Cesar and I. That wild guy on the left is me. And I'll never forget the meeting with Cesar. He was such a spiritual guy, and it just radiated this aura about him, you know. And I'll never forget, after we talked and I told him about the peace group, and he was walking away and he turned and he said to me, nothing will stop peace and justice, will it? And the way he said it was so profound, you know, I was speechless, and I just, you know, nodded, yes, nothing will stop it. I'll never forget it. Okay, so the first project we had was helping the farm workers, food, clothing, leafleting the shopping centers. You get all kinds of reactions, you know. Those of you that leafleted know it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. You know, you never know, but you do your thing and you try to make a contribution. I formed a draft project because I saw that the draftees were coming in. They had no idea about their rights. Like me, when I told you when I went to Fort Holabird and I had no clue about my rights. So we did leaflets and had the names of a whole list of draft attorneys who volunteered to counsel for free. And that was so important to people. The first leaflets were not bilingual. I didn't get it. I didn't think about it. And then these Spanish draftees would go shrug, and I would try in my pathetic Spanish to relate to them, and I gave up. God knows what I was saying to them. And so we made it bilingual. And this is a skeptical draft board clerk. I would always try to talk to them respectfully, you know, never came at them, you know, murderer, that kind of, never that, was always with respect. And you can see she's listening with respect, even skeptically, of course, but she's listening. And this is the third project, beyond the draft project, I formed, it's called the Constellation Project, and it became a worldwide nonviolent campaign. It started with a grassroots movement. When I started Nonviolent Action, there were 4 people. So I encourage all of you in Peace Action, you know, the beginnings look small to something. You never know, you stay positive and persistent, and you can amaze yourself with what can happen. It started with 4 people. The 3 people looked at me, the 4 people looked at me, and they go, where's everybody else? And I said, they're on the way, but they don't know it yet. You know, I had just faith that this is going to happen. And so we formed it, And we did the Farm Works Project and the Draft Project. The last one was the Constellation Project. This is the USS Constellation aircraft carrier. When we do our invasions of other countries, you know, we have aircraft carriers sent off the coast of these countries to back it up and do the bombing. And as you probably know, that heaviest bombing war in the history of the world, we rained on Vietnam, that small country, technological giant raining on a non-technological country. And then what I've learned from other books that I didn't know about is that we come in and we offer to rebuild these countries for economic gain. I never realized this aspect of war. So this is what I call the Motorville Campaign, this photograph. This is me at the front here, and the banner says, Connie, stay home for peace. So we started by leafleting and educating people about the tremendous amount of resources, billions of dollars going out for what? For war when we had so many people needs. Let's go to war with cancer. Let's go to war with, you know, providing free healthcare and education. That's where the war should be. Let's go to war with war itself. New priorities. We're still battling the military industrial complex that is waging these wars at the expense of we, the people. So stay vigilant. You know, we've all got to stay around positive people, each other. That's why this is beautiful, your peace action group, mutual support. You know, when I met, I'll get to it later, but there's a picture of George McGovern, who supported my peace group and introduced it to the US Congress. And I was so grateful for that. I'll get to more about it. But George, one of the things he said to me, I'll never forget, when I thanked him for his support in nonviolent action, I said, you know, I don't know how you keep going. And I don't even know how I kept going, because it's so overwhelming sometimes. You know, you look at the system and what we can do, and sometimes it seems such a small dent. And he said, you know what? As long as you're right, that's all that matters. As long as you're following your convictions. And there's a ripple effect, and it adds up. Every small act of kindness, you know, it adds up. So that really, I took that away from him, and I'll never forget it. So the Motorville campaign was, we went out to the carrier and they would have inspections on deck, and it's hard to see it, but there's rows of sailors on here on inspection, and we'd show them the sign, and the back row would turn and sneak a look at our sign. And by that time, 1970, the GIs and the sail, everything, the military was turning about the war, and they were against the war. And so they would flash us surreptitiously the peace sign themselves, but they would have to hide it. They were very brave about that. And this is from Newsweek magazine. This is me at the front of the boat. And I would make these runs. I got to tell you, as Brad knows from reading the book, the Navy sent Coast Guard, their I forgot what they call it, swift boats out to capsize our boat. They attacked the boat. You know, this is crazy. And they went full speed at the boat and then swerved away to cast the water into our boat, hoping to sink it. But we managed to stay afloat for over 10 minutes. And it's an emotional moment when they finally gave up and went away. A rousing cheer went up from the deck of the Constellation aircraft carrier. They were watching and they had sympathy, and the officers angrily dispersed them and made them go below deck. But I'll never forget that moment either. And there it is. That's Newsweek. And when my parents saw it, I asked them, you know, what'd you think? And my mom says, I thought, where did we go wrong? So anyhow, mixed emotion on that one for my parents. Here it is. So I faced the draft for 8 years, and my case was 3 years on appeal. And I would send poetry, pictures to my draft board. I wanted to humanize it, the whole situation. And Joyce, the draft board clerk, is the one I came to know. And I said to her, here's the picture that symbolizes for me all the conscientious objectors that face the draft. It's a long, arduous path, a long, lonely path too, full of, you know, all the hate and all the misunderstandings and the slander, etc. You just got to stay strong and see it through. And I said, this painting by Monet symbolizes this for me. So that's what I sent her. My lawyer was totally against this. He said, you know, every time you send stuff, they put it in the file, they probably forward it to the FBI. You know, the FBI is monitoring you. They even called me to tell me they were monitoring me, so it's not my imagination or anything. And I would say for months, all my mail from my fiance and I was ripped open, and I complained to the post office, but for months and months, every letter was ripped open. They wanted us to know that they were monitoring us. And later I read that was a standard practice of the FBI for intimidation, and they'd let you get your mail, peace activist, but it was all torn open and inspected. So here's the drama point, folks. The case faced the draft for 8 years, 3 years on appeal. They turned me down. The draft board, my lawyer, the ninth lawyer, I'm going to mention his name, Charlie Corey. He lives in San Diego today. We're close buddies. He stayed with my case, and we fought all the time, of course, because he wanted me to be practical and he wanted me to take loopholes to get out of the draft and finagle my way out, and I refused. But he said he respected that, but he didn't want to see me to go to prison. And like my parents, they were on board philosophically with my anti-war views. They raised me with it, but they didn't want to see their son go to prison. So they wanted me to go to Canada or fake my way out of the draft. But I refused both alternatives. And so on the final appeal, I'm ready to go to prison. My attorney says it's almost definite. It's going to be 5 years, the maximum term. And my girlfriend said, I wanted to leave you so many times, but I finally decided I'm going to stay with it. And I'll even move to the prison area where you're going to be sent. So it's hard for me to even talk about that today because, excuse me for a moment, but I put my family and my fiance through so much pain for this. I thought this would just be my individual stand, but I underestimated, you know, the pain that I put my parents through and my fiance through. And I want to make amends that I also neglected my relationship for the peace work. You know, I have no regret about doing the peace work, but to the extent that I did it and neglecting the home front with my parents and my fiance, I do have regrets about that. So it's getting time for prison. And I talked to COs that had served to get a realistic idea, what's it going to be like in prison? And they counseled me. And so we had one last appeal. The final appeal is to the state director of selective service above the draft board in Virginia. So I make the appeal. I say to my parents and everybody, I prep everybody for the prison. And at the last moment, the state director of selective service goes against his own system in my favor. And he rules this guy is a sincere CO. And it set a precedent for COs across the country, because at that time, it was strongly on only a traditional religious view that you had a better chance of getting recognized. Spiritual but non-religious just didn't fly, especially in Virginia. And he went against the system, very brave. And I just had so much admiration for the courage of this guy. And here he is getting recognition because Nixon wanted to show they're finally integrating the system. If you can imagine, this guy's name was Ernest Fears Jr., and he was the first African-American anywhere in America. Imagine this. Up to 1971, there's not a single Black anywhere in that position, all white. So far behind. So Nixon wanted to show they're integrating, and he picks a state that's not known for its civil rights to show that they're finally integrating, and I happen to get them. How fortunate am I? And to be in this guy's presence. And so there it is, and he's being honored, and it's just the miracle happened. That's all I can say. And that's what my attorney said. The miracle happened. I had to drive my draft card over to my attorney because he was so in disbelief, and he thought I was seeing what I want to see. Maybe I was delusional, and seeing what I wanted to see, that I won the case. But sure enough, he said it's the real deal. So there it is. This is La Jolla in San Diego. And I would go to a reef and meditate, you know, just to summon the strength to get through this ordeal, because I thought my future is 5 years in prison. And it nearly was. I came about as close as you can come without actually going in. And I'm so proud that my attorney, you know, there's so many draft attorneys who dedicated themselves. He never asked, my attorney never asked for a dime for over a year. It was all just his firm conviction, I got to help these guys. And that's what he did. And all the COs that went through this, you know, so this, even though I refuse to kill, is a personal story, it's the wider picture too. And it pays tribute throughout history, not just the 60s. This is throughout history and world history that these people have said no to war. And I finally got a chance to thank Senator McGovern for his support of my peace group. And I told you what he said, you know, we were right. That's what he said. And he said the same thing when he was defeated by Nixon. You know, the irony is he lost to Nixon by the biggest margin in American history. And yet, look who had the biggest majority. Nixon, who was facing prison for his misdeeds, and then he resigns. And this guy had such a strong moral character. So it shows you on the surface of things, you know, again, turn to the heart. You know what's right. Follow the heart. To thine own self be true. Now, jump ahead to present day. I hope you enjoy the time travel, folks. You know, here we are today to this senseless war, totally unnecessary, violent war invasion. And you know the language, double language. This is a friend of mine, is a photojournalist who took this. He went to Poland as the Ukrainian refugees are pouring in, and he took this. And it's just so symbolic to me. Stand with Ukraine. The refugees are suffering so much. We take so much for granted in our lives. The food, the shelter, the clean water, all the basics. They have none of it. And so, you know, we got to support them. I have a fundraiser coming up in Los Angeles. If you know anybody in Los Angeles, May 1st here in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica, we're going to have a fundraiser for Ukrainian refugees, and have a band playing. We're going to play some Beatles songs and all that, but we want to definitely stand with Ukraine and the refugees. And we're still against war, period, but we want to help these people in the meantime, and it's going to be through Red Cross. This is the brave, you know, you got to give credit to these people that are refusing the war within Russia, the brave anti-war Russians. Who can conceive that? You know, it was hard enough in America to do that. Imagine in Russia, where if you even speak the wrong way, you can face up to 15 years in prison. 15 years for a speech that they take as anti-military. You don't follow the rules of, as everybody probably knows now, this is so iconic. This is a producer at the Russian main #1 TV station who got in her 2 cents, holds up the no war sign, said, what you're listening to is lies and propaganda, you know, and they've detained over 15,000 people so far. So, you know, you take huge risk. So I've part of my story now in talking to media is to stand with the anti-war Russians and tell people, do not generalize Putin with the Russians in general. You know, the people are different from that. This is what happened with Vietnam. When I traveled to Europe with my family, I saw so much hatred about Americans and what we were doing in Vietnam. And it was hard for them to distinguish between President Johnson and President Nixon and the war people, war makers, and the American people. Prejudice just was building up about Americans. So that's what happens. And today we've got to counter the prejudice that's developing in America against Russian people in general. So we are aware that we don't slip into that. And You know, here's an example. This is a woman, an elderly woman on a subway in Moscow. And this is her form of protest. I think it's a beautiful image. And there she is making her statement. Well, today, bringing it up today, we're trying to develop the story, I Refuse to Kill, to speak to the power of nonviolence as a documentary and a feature film. That's our goal now. So we're promoting the book as much as possible. If you could help us spread the word, very grateful for that. And we want to show people war is not inevitable unless you think it is. We want to tell people humans are not innately violent. They are born, as my father would say, to love and be loved. We have to be programmed and trained to kill. And so conscientious objection should be, as the United Nations says, a right universally around the world in every country. Everyone should have the right to say, I refuse to kill. And this is Richard Dreyfuss, who was also a conscientious objector, and he's already donated an on-camera interview for the documentary. So we're off to a good start and want to go to feature film also. And the last thing, let me see if there's the cover. But I guess what I want to leave you with is you don't have to do something big. You know, we can all do something in our microcosm, and we can all be kind to each other, and we can do what we can in our own thing. Don't get overwhelmed by the big picture. It all adds up. Like I said, it's a ripple effect. Okay, so let's spread the love and do what we can and encourage each other. So thank you so much. Let me see, Carrie here is going to open it up.
Wow.
Okay, back
Thank
to the
you.
group.
There we go. Francesco, thank you so much. What an amazing story, truly. I mean,
Thank
from the
you.
literal tip of the hat to JFK all the way through, just
Thank you.
absolutely amazing.
To you guys.
Yeah, we have a number of conscientious objectors with us this evening, joining us, and I
great.
think their status was, of course, religious beliefs, but yours was different. And I was wondering if you could just take a minute and sort of tell us what your belief was, since it was not based on religion.
Well, my dad was raised by a pacifist father, and so his father, when he was asked about religion, he would simply point to his heart. And he said, you know, my belief is how much, the degree to which you're religious is the degree to which you live your beliefs. And so my father got that. In fact, my father paid tribute to him, but my father's father died. The tombstone said, quoted Abraham Lincoln and said, with malice to none. And so that I picked that up from my father. And my father said, you know, love is the answer, not war. And show kindness in your day-to-day life. And even though, like I said, he didn't want to see his son go to prison, you know, I had that philosophy, that world philosophy, that we're all one family, essentially. So I took that to heart. He was more practical than I was. I lacked common sense. And, you know, I was steely in my determination. And I clung to those beliefs, but I took a lot of ostracism, and my family paid for it. My parents were forced to leave a cocktail party in Virginia because they knew the basis that I didn't do a religious belief, and I didn't do didn't believe in serving in the military, and they ostracized my parents so much at a party they had to leave. So that was Virginia, and paid the price. But those are the, you know, it says my kindness, you know, was the bottom up. Fred Rogers talked about it, you know, just be kind to one another. Let's show what we can. That was the basis of my beliefs. And I got to say, let's accept each other. You know, if you're atheist, agnostic, if you're fundamental, whatever the religious beliefs are, you know, let's accept each other. I mean, that's what America is supposed to be all about. And let's be kind to one another and be more forgiving in our approach. We can maintain our own integrity, but let's be more accepting. You know, we're so divided now. Let's tolerate differences more. That's what my buddy Jerry and I did with Vietnam and anti-Vietnam.
Yeah, the interesting point about Jerry that you mentioned in the book is that Jerry ended up writing a letter to the draft board for you in
Yes.
support of your conscientious objector status, even though he was in the service. You want to mention that quickly and just sort of?
Yeah, and he said in the letter, he said, I want to make it clear, this is something I don't subscribe to. This is something I would never do for myself, never even consider it. And I believe the president, knows best, kind of thing. And, there it is. And it was both ways, just that mutual respect.
That's wonderful. Wonderful friendship. A lot of these iconic figures that you met. Oh, and please, people, the participants, ask questions. Francesco wanted to have a Q&A, so put your questions in the chat box when you have them, and we will get to them. I have a couple here that I've collected from people who sent in when they registered. In addition to conscientious objectors watching tonight, we also have some war tax resistors, and I think you have a little bit of experience with that as well.
Yes,
so could you talk about that?
There's a humorous part of that too, even though it was a sincere moral conviction that I started withholding my tax at that time. Like the phone tax was one of the big movements at the time to hold back your phone tax as a protest about the war, the taxes going to war. So I did that, and I go into my bank to make another paltry withdrawal from my meager savings. And the manager calls me over and he goes, Francesco, come over here, in kind of a secretive tone. And he goes, you troublemaker, you. And I go, what do you mean? And he says, you're withholding your taxes for your phone tax. And I said, yes. He said, the FBI came in here, 2 agents, and they collected your taxes. They withdrew it from your account. I said, how much was it? He said, $3.66. And I thought to myself, they don't have anything better to do than go after that. So anyhow, that was the humorous thing. But I did consistent. And then on my bills, I would write the reason that I was withholding. So I would send that message across on the bills.
These iconic figures that you met, Bobby Kennedy and Joan Baez, Cesar Chavez, they're larger than life to us now. And I'm wondering if at the time when you met them, if you recognized how truly unique they were. And I wonder what your thoughts are. Is there anybody like that around today?
Well, that's a good question. There aren't many. But, whenever people stand up for their beliefs, I try to support. And fortunately, there are a lot of now, because of social media, we're in touch with many more people. Maybe there are fewer iconic people, that are taking the stand and leading. But I'd like to mention a few alternatives that I proposed that, might change things a bit. I was thinking if we could get somebody, it's an old idea, but a Department of Peace, somebody in the president's cabinet that says no to war, that offers the alternatives. It's so unusual for us to be dealing with sanctions. This is an age-old nonviolent technique, and now here it is at the forefront, and we don't want to risk nuclear war. But let's get somebody in the president's cabinet that there's more alternatives to going. We go to war way too easily. So that's one of the things I'd like to see happen. A cabinet figure that disarmament, the nuclear danger is incredible. And people talk about whether we'll go to war with Russia or over Ukraine or whatever, wherever it is, Middle East or whatever. But, there's been so many near misses and accidents. Shortly after President Kennedy was inaugurated, a couple of days, I think it was, a nuclear bomber crashed in North Carolina. And the public still doesn't know about this. And there have been nervous breakdowns in silos where people wanted to launch. So, this is one of the things we should address. And hopefully we'll get more and more people standing up and get a few heroes for this generation. But let's not, the Dalai Lama, when I photographed the Dalai Lama, he would always say, don't be dependent on these external either iconic figures or organizations. You know, he would say, look within first and then outward.
Yeah, excellent advice. That's great. Reading one of the questions from the chat, an individual says, can you say anything about the role of draft and military counselors? Is that something that needs to be built up again?
Definitely. The more the better. And there are conscientious objector organizations. There's a big one in Washington, San Francisco. There are national networks. And I can't say enough to these dedicated people that, you know, they just are so dedicated and they put the monetary stuff aside and do the right thing. And, you know, these people are in need. They're at a crossroads and it affects their whole life. So more power, and we need the more the better. And I got to say, there are certain areas that can be examples. When I went to the Bay Area, they had drafts refuser support systems in place that would help the families of COs. I mean, it would walk them all the way through the legal counseling. I couldn't even believe it. I was in San Diego. I was lucky to find one lawyer. They had and when I went to the Bay Area, people would walk up and say, thank you for your service as a conscientious objector. You know, it was just shocking. I was speechless. So we can do more to be supportive in our own communities with the draft counselors, to have those support systems. And it means so much.
It does. And it seems like there was such a support system in the anti-war movement of the 60s. You know, the anti-war movement of the 60s actually ended a war. I don't think that's ever happened in American history before.
First time a young generation stopped war. Amazing. And, you know, I got to tell you a funny thing about this. It was so pervasive that climate of anti-war and the young generation being, you know, today's generation is very split. We have the gift that we were so related in spirit, the anti-war people, and internationally. And I mean, remember the trial, the Chicago 9? Well, Abby Hoffman, you know, they would think the government and people monitoring the peace activists, they were convinced that it must be a communist conspiracy because it was spreading so much everywhere, you know. And Abby Hoffman, when they asked him about it, was this a conspiracy? He said, you got to be kidding me. We can't even agree where to have lunch. We could never organize politically, and we have so many differences. So I thought that was an amusing thing, but that spirit was there, and you're right, first time ever to stop a war. But I got to tell you, it was a big price, and it was persistence, marching in the street year after year, and to pay tribute to the peace activists out there who put themselves on the line. The war started in 1964. The protest built up from 65 on and build and build and build. And finally, the tide turned. And then the GI movement around 1970, roughly. And then the soldiers turned, and people were disobeying their orders to, you know, in battle, they would just refuse to do the battles and saying, this is an unjust, you know, we got to get out of this. This is a mistake. So that was a complete turnaround in that shift. And let's honor those people. The history books have been distorted, you know, either by omission or, you know, a political agenda to distort the 60s legacy. So let's correct that, get it straight in the history books. Let's set the record straight finally.
Absolutely. Do you think today we have the ability to form a broad-based, cohesive movement against the military-industrial complex, given the divisions?
Peace action is a little example right here. You know, this is like ripple on the water. It just spreads out. You never know what effect you're having and how it grows. In the beginning, so many things have seemed totally impossible. And then when it happens, it looks like it's inevitable. There's that flip. So we just stay persistent. And like I said about war, you know, war is not inevitable unless we think it is. And you got to remember, we're not getting the straight scoop from the news. It's all negative. You know, that's what sells. It's all negative oriented. And look at Russia. I mean, my God, one main station for them to be, they're brainwashed. And, you know, you can't even use the proper, it's kind of Orwellian. If you've read 1984, you know, there it is in Russia. You know, He calls it SMO, a special military operation. Well, I've got my own abbreviation for that. I call it a senseless military onslaught. But I would be facing up to 15 years in prison to say that. And if you call the invasion an invasion or you call the war a war, same thing. So, let's appreciate the freedoms we have, but let's show the eternal vigilance and do what we can. And yes, I do think it's possible if we think it's possible. Stay positive. I mean, look what we're fighting for peace. We're fighting for love. We're fighting for the positive things in life. All this hate and thing. Does Putin look happy? No. It's spreading the hate and division. So let's stand for the positive things in our own life individually, and then let it ripple out.
Yeah, well said. Well said. One of the questions are you still being monitored by the FBI or the Army?
People have asked me that, and I think it's now that I have the book out and that I'm talking to you people, unsavory as you are, no kidding. So, but I think it's definitely a good chance because I have the book out now, and I'm encouraging people about nonviolent activism. But I kind of laugh it off though, because I don't want to be intimidated by it, and I want to let people know they're not alone in these convictions. And I want to stand up. I'll take whatever inconvenience there is for the bigger picture. The sound went out for a while.
There we go. Sorry.
Okay.
One of the first campaigns that you undertook with your nonviolent group was with the migrant farm workers, and I'm wondering if you could talk about how you see the linkage between anti-war activities, anti-war movements, and labor movements, particularly for underrepresented populations like the migrant workers in California.
Yeah, well, one of the beautiful things about peace activism is the concern for humanity. The famous sayings have been like, if one person suffers, we all suffer, So the rights we're talking about human rights that the UN espouses. So it's a natural carryover to be concerned for our brothers and sisters, no matter what they are doing and how they're suffering. It's our suffering. Look at Ukraine, and not a day goes by, I'm thinking about these refugees. So it's that empathy. If we had a strong sense of empathy in our government, we wouldn't be having these wars. So it's that compassion and acting on it. So there is that connection. We're all related. My dad always looked at us all as one family, basically.
And the role of nonviolence in terms of actual nonviolence resistance, it's very different than pacifism. And you intentionally named your group Nonviolent Action. And I was wondering if you could talk about why.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's one of the biggest myths going about nonviolence, that it's passive. I've never personally been a believer in just turn the other cheek. I've always believed in the activism, taking a stand, expressing your views. Everybody has to decide for themselves what's right about their conscience. But for me, the beauty about conscientious objection was, in the process, you're able to affirm your beliefs. You're saying to your draft board, rather than just wait to be arrested, you affirm your beliefs, you put them down, and you express and you welcome that dialogue. That's one of the things I love about conscientious objection and why I went for it. Otherwise, if you just resist, and nothing against doing that, everybody has to decide for themselves what's right. Some people, it's right to go to Canada, whatever. But for myself, I wanted to face it, have the dialogue, and convey when I set out the beliefs that nonviolence is not passive. And here's all the examples of how I'm trying to apply nonviolence, and not just say, well, philosophically this. I want to show by my action, live it. So Gandhi always made us aware, and he said, think about your thoughts, your words, and your actions. And if you can make those as harmonious as possible, that's the power of nonviolence.
He wrote extensively about the means being consistent with the ends. And it brings up a topic that sometimes is debated in the nonviolent movement, which is destruction of government property. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I feel very strongly about that. You know, I've always believed don't sacrifice the means for the end. And Gandhi would say the seed is connected to the tree that grows from the seed. Same with means and ends. There's an inviolable connection. So to me, destruction of the property, you're taking a risk. You know, it's not just property to begin with. I don't believe in destroying property anyhow, either on a moral level or on a practical level. I think there's always backlash that's going to come 10 times stronger than what you faced before. And in the case of violent actions, the repression historically has always come back incredibly, you know, it just increased it that much more. And so I don't feel practical or morally that is justified. And the case in point is, as we were getting closer to the 1970, at the end of the 60s, students were, not just students, but anti-war activists were blowing up buildings, you know, setting it. And there was one in particular that they said was the death of the anti-war movement, because it resulted, they were going for a research center, and there happened to be a researcher who went to his lab in the middle of the morning, and he was there when the explosives went off and he died. And he had a family, children, and, you know, I know that reading about this in a memoir, one of the activists that was part of that, you just broke down and cried when they learned, because they thought it would be safe, that nobody would be there. And you never know. It's arrogant to me to say, you know, to assume, don't assume anything, and you can count on the backlash to the movement. So everything that I was working for, everything that my group was working for, and the anti-war and peace movement in general was set back with that kind of thing, because the repression came in stronger. And then people like Nixon and Johnson could use it and say, see, this is what the anti-war movement is really about. And it would play on people's prejudices, and they would generalize. In the marches, what I went to, if I can expand on this a little bit, because it's so important, the point you brought up. In the marches, there were people there were a lot of undercover agents, and they were told to discredit the march by acting crazy, by giving third world rhetoric, you know, waving North Vietnamese flags, etc. So some of them, of course, were, you know, actual people that believed these things and were expressing in their own off way, you know, that was true. But there were a lot of undercover people doing that. And the media, and I'm the journalist, and I saw it, and they would flock to these people because it was great news. It was great for the cameras. It was great entertainment. And then the public, of course, sees this and they generalize. So this distortion, you know, is something we have to be aware of. And when you talk about means and ends, whether it was civil rights movement or whether it was a peace movement, when people sacrifice the means for a supposed good end, it was almost always disaster. And then an example of, one more thing, I'm getting carried away here. I'm gonna cut it real fast, but in World War II, I have to pay tribute to the Danish people. You know, they let Hitler's army come in rather than resist them militarily. They would have been instantly crushed, as other countries were. They let them come in, and then they worked underground and they rescued over 7,000 Jews, the best record of any country in World War II to save the Jews without using the weapons.
Perfect. We have a question along these same lines. What do you think about the Berrigan's actions, like the Catonsville Nine? And that was Phil and Dan Berrigan, Jesuit and a Josephite priest, going into the draft board office, removing induction papers, taking them outside, and burning them with homemade napalm.
I think I would draw a distinction between where no human beings, there's no risk to human beings, it was something that I personally wouldn't be in favor of for myself, but I have total respect for the Berrigans following their conscience because they're not risking another human life for what they're doing. You know, it can be argued that maybe their actions created more backlash, maybe not, maybe more sympathy. But I think no one doubts that it came from the heart and they're acting out of courage and they're following their convictions. No one can. And you talk about napalm, if I can diverge for one moment on that, the history of napalm, a lot of us don't realize that was developed out of our highest institution, Harvard. I think it was like somewhere in the 40s. And this is an example of we're putting our best minds to work on anti-personnel weapons, on napalm. You're talking about anti-personnel weapons that burn through the skin to the bones at such an incredible boiling point temperature that you can't even imagine. Look at the landmines, and we still have yet to ratify against landmines. And we've had so many opportunities to do that. There's an issue that still needs support. And today, can you believe 50 years later, Cambodia, for example, is still removing the mines from the rice fields. And you're talking about so many people that have lost their arms and legs to these weapons. And now Russia is mining Ukraine. And they attach it to trigger wires and all that other stuff. But again, it's the priorities, and we've got to reevaluate, hold ourselves responsible. Let's find out what companies are, making these weapons. Let's boycott these companies, and let's bring it to the public's attention, the realities of this. So I'm glad you brought up that point.
Sure. Yeah, you mentioned the landmines still present in Southeast Asia, and I saw that we have joining us tonight Titus Peachy, who's involved in a group that is over to recover the landmines and try to take those
Correct.
out. It's unbelievable. It's
And the
wonderful
children,
work.
look at the children.
All right. Following the Berrigan theme, prison witness was something that they believed in a great deal, and you were looking at 5 years of a possible jail sentence. Did you see that as a form of witness?
I'm not clear on the question.
So the Berrigans deeply felt that going to prison was a form of protest, a form of witness, consistent with their moral beliefs. Sort of what does it say about our country that they imprison truth tellers, the best of us? Is that something, when you were looking at prison, were you entertaining that idea as well?
I never glorified prison at all, but there were people in the peace movement that did glorify prison, and I took a different view of it. I thought, I'm willing to go if I have to go. And I would talk to other COs, and some of them had regrets about that on their decision to go to prison, and some said they were proud that they went to prison. They made a community out of it. One of the COs said to me, there's all different ways you can do your time. And he said, one of the great ironies that I found, I went to prison and I expected to be a total outcast as a conscientious objector. And he said it was just the opposite. He said, I got more respect in prison than I got on the outside. So that's pretty crazy.
Yeah. Well, I want to be respectful of your time and everybody else's. I thought it might be a nice idea to conclude with a quote from your book here.
Oh, thank you.
And you say towards the end, we cannot be silent in a violent world. We cannot withdraw and only find peace with ourselves. We must translate our principles into action and service. I know of no better way to do this than by the truth of nonviolence. And this, it reminds me of Christ imploring us to be peacemakers, meaning that we have to make the peace. We have to act. We can't just sit and wait for it or just pray for it. We have to make it. And is that how you feel today still?
Absolutely. Let's wage peace.
Wonderful. Thank
you. And I'm honored to be here, and I salute all of you and thank you for your service.
Thank you so much. Let's have a virtual round of applause for Francesco. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, what a wonderful story. Really appreciate you sharing it with us. And again, IRefusetoKill.com. Please, everybody go out, take a look at it, buy it. We look forward to hearing when it's going to be made into a documentary and a movie. That will be wonderful to see. Before we leave, I think Luke Martin had an announcement, and then we will be able to wrap things up. Luke, do you want to let folks know what's going on?
Yes, Carl Stauffer has agreed to meet virtually with 1040 for Peace and Lancaster's Peace Action Network on Tuesday evening, May 10 at 7:30. Stauffer is a senior expert on reconciliation for the U.S. Institute of Peace, beginning there in 2020 after 30 years of experience in 37 countries as both a practitioner and academic. Before joining the Institute for Peace, he was associate professor at the Center of Justice and Peacemaking at Eastern Mennonite College University. Prior to that, he served 16 years in South Africa, gaining orientation working with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and participated in community policing forums and local development committees. The organization, Mennonite Central Committee, appointed him as regional peace coordinator, which gave him the opportunity to travel and work in post-war conflict hotspots in 20 different countries across Africa. He earned his doctorate in conflict resolution and peace studies from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. I knew him as a child because he was born into the family of colleagues of ours in Saigon, Vietnam in 1964, a date that our speaker tonight mentioned. And when he was 4 years old in 1968, his family had to flee from one area of Saigon to another during the Tet Offensive of that spring and summer. Stauffer received his bachelor's degree in social work and religious studies and his master's in conflict transformation from Eastern Mennonite University. He entered the field of reconciliation in 1991 as executive director of the Vietnam Offender Reconciliation Program in Richmond, Virginia. As a seasoned peace builder and reconciliation practitioner, Stauffer has done consulting and training with organizations like UN and other government agencies, and with many international service organizations. His areas of expertise include transitional justice, trauma recovery and resilience, post-war reconstruction, restorative justice, peace-building processes, and nonviolent social action. We hope you can join and invite others to join.
Wonderful. Thank you, Luke. And again, thank you to Francesco. There were some great comments in here, Francesco, folks thanking you for tonight, saying what a wonderful night it was. So again, we really appreciate your being here. And,
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to just say, never give up.
Words well spoken. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. You all have a good evening. Stay safe, stay peaceful, and I look forward to seeing you all again. Take care.